Thanks, and thanks so much to the organizers for putting on this very cool workshop. So the puzzle I'm concerned with today has to do when an author of a fiction communicates about their work through means other than the work itself, after the work has been created and disseminated. So here are some examples just to warm you up to the idea. In 2000, Blade Runner director Ridley Scott confirmed what many fans of the movie had long suspected, that Deckard, the replicant-hunting protagonist of the film, was himself a replicant. So without kind of getting too much into the spoilers of the film, basically, the idea is that there's a robot-hunting police officer in the future, and this person is charged with trying to figure out who is a robot and who is not, and the robots basically are executed or deactivated. And there was this ambiguity in the film about whether the police officer himself was actually a robot, since he comes across as kind of emotionless and flat. And so much, much later, the director said that he had intended for the protagonist to be a robot. That is, the protagonist was, in fact, a robot. Another example, in 2009, J.K. Rowling, the famous author of the Harry Potter series of books, surprised audiences by proclaiming that Dumbledore, a central character in the book series, was gay. And she did this on Twitter and in several public interviews suddenly. And this was also interesting because she was speaking out about an aspect of the fiction that was not, in fact, in the original fiction. So I'm concerned with what I call extra-fictional communications of exactly this sort. Let's suppose that it involves, first, a public communication by an author to an audience. So that means they can't just kind of say it to their husband or something like that. It has to be a suitably public announcement about the fiction. That provides more information about the world of a previously released fiction. And also, it is not in the paradigm form of the original work. That is a formal sequel to the fiction or a prequel in the movies. So for example, the Star Wars prequel would not actually count as an extra fictional communication on my account because it's in the form of the original work and stuff like that. So the puzzle is, how are we to think of these extra-fictional communications, that is EFCs, by authors after the original publication and dissemination of their original works? What is their relationship to the original fiction? And one nice thing about this topic is I think it actually ties into the new Veni Project grant that was announced, because sometimes these extra-fictional communications are happening now on social media. So the authors themselves will say something on Twitter or TikTok or even Instagram, shedding light on the original work. So I take there to be at least 3 views about this. I'm going to describe each one and argue for the last one, but I'm not sure these are exhaustive. This is something we might talk about in the question and answer period. The 3 views are what I call outsiderism, insiderism, and borderline fiction. And I will be arguing for borderline fiction after talking about the first 2. So, with respect to our central question, which is, what is the relationship of an extra-fictional communication to its original work? Let's call outsiderism the view that an extra-fictional communication is not a part of the fiction. And I think, this view has some intuitive appeal, right? We tend to think, once someone publishes something and disseminates it, it's kind of done and over. They might try to shed light on it later, but there's something kind of pure about the original work as it was created and disseminated. A variant formulation of outsiderism, or a variant framing, is that an extra-fictional communication is simply not true according to the original fiction. So if you want to think about it in terms of truth conditions, that would be a way to think about it. So according to that view, Deckard is not a replicant, according to Blade Runner, and Dumbledore is not gay, according to the original Harry Potter corpus, even if those were things said by the authors later. So there's some benefits of outsiderism of this view. I think the first benefit is that it forestalls the worry that authors can make things true according to their fictions that they formulate long after the original works. So suppose that, a semi-famous author just kind of has too much to drink one night and tweets about something in the original fiction. It seems like, do we want to consider that a part of the original fiction? I don't know, it's a little scary when authors can really change the original fiction long after it was disseminated. So we just cut off this worry by being like, nope, this is not a part of the original fiction at all, even if the author themselves is talking about it. This view also has a straightforward answer as to which communications rise to the level of extrafictional communications. That is, like, none do if we're trying to figure out if it actually changes the original fiction. So the idea here is an author can say what they want, but nothing that they say will rise to the level of changing the original work, whereas if we wanted some other sort of view, we would have to have an answer to the question, when do these things rise to the level where we should take them really seriously, artistically, and exegetically? So some drawbacks of this view include the following. First, I think it has trouble accounting for cases of ambiguity in fiction. For example, is it true according to the original Harry Potter that Dumbledore is then not gay? It seems difficult, when we're trying to answer this question, because if there's already been light shed on the question by the author, I think we'd be reluctant to say, nope, he's not gay, I'm just sticking to the original fiction, even after the author has clarified the matter. It might be tempting for the outsiderist to say something like, this is just still a matter of interpretation. It just turns out that we have very strong evidence for a particular interpretation. That is, the author said it was true that Dumbledore was gay. But it seems difficult once the author themselves has clarified it to still leave it open to interpretation if they've come down in particular on a question. So that's just a little overview of the outsiderist view. Next, consider another view I call insiderism. So, according to this view, an extrafictional communication just is a part of the original fiction if it rises to a certain level. And there are a couple different formulations of this. We're beginning at the top of page 2 now of your handout. The first is that an extrafictional communication should count as an expansion of the original fiction. So, thus, it is suddenly true, according to Blade Runner, that Deckard is a replicant, since the expansion of Blade Runner now includes the extrafictional communication that the author has made. And similarly with Dumbledore being gay in Harry Potter. So basically what an author does in an extrafictional communication is to just make the fiction bigger in a way, make there be more things that we have to account for in an extra truth or set of truths. So in this idea, a complete fiction is going to include an extrafictional communication, and it will also include its truth conditions. So I do think there's something to be said intuitively for this view as well. For example, when I lead off with my examples about Harry Potter and Blade Runner, I always feel like maybe I should give a spoiler alert for people who, haven't seen Blade Runner or haven't, read Harry Potter. And the reason that's important here is because it seems like intuitively I am giving you a key piece of information about the work that the author themselves has communicated, not just some kind of extra secondary source or interpretation, but there's really something informative going on when I give you these facts. So, a challenge here for the insiderist is going to be distinguishing between authorial communications that expand the fiction and other mere ex post facto reflective interpretations and declarations of authorial intent. So, again here, suppose that someone just casually says to their friend in the toilet, and this person is a famous author, that they intended for some character to, be gay and closeted or something like that. I mean, I think it's difficult, does this really rise to the level of an extrafictional communication? On the one hand, it seems kind of private, so we really wouldn't want it to, but the insiderist is going to have an answer to this, because in order to have a complete fiction, they will have to have an answer to the question which extrafictional communications should count as expanding the fiction and which ones should not. So it seems like not every communication by an author about a fiction rises to the level of importance or precision that it should expand the original fictional canon. And this doesn't just have to do with how the extrafictional communication is executed or communicated. It also has to do, in my mind, with the stakes of the extrafictional communication. So suppose that Ridley Scott, that director of Blade Runner, casually muses about the meaning of the concrete steel planters on the Blade Runner set that otherwise have no big meaning in the film. I'm not sure that sort of utterance should actually count as expanding the fiction. It just doesn't seem like it has to do with like a key question inside the fiction in the way that we should really take it seriously in our interpretation. Another formulation of insiderism holds that an extra-fictional communication is a disambiguation of a dimension of ambiguity already present in the fictional world. So it's no surprise that in a lot of fictional worlds that we see, there's a lot of ambiguity. That's part of what makes fiction great. We like, imagining things. Many books have open endings. Many movies have open endings. So when J.K. Rowling declares that Dumbledore is gay, what she's doing, according to this sort of view, is precisifying something left vague in the fiction. Similarly, with Ridley Scott declaring that Deckard is a replicant, this is just an issue left intentionally ambiguous in the film that is then disambiguated by an author with specific intent. So that is, there is a dimension of ambiguity in the original fiction, and then it's made more determinate or precisified by the author themselves. But I think this also faces a few explanatory burdens and challenges, this sort of formulation of insiderism. So the first one is that, as Williams and Woodward in our audience note, there are several different ways a fiction can remain silent on a particular issue, and also correspondingly different ways that fictions can be filled in by the author. So a fiction can simply not address a particular issue at all, as is the case of the exact shape of Hermione's ears in the original Harry Potter books. These were just simply not talked about. A fiction can introduce an ambiguity, as in the case of the original Blade Runner, hinting that Deckard is a replicant without explicitly coming down on either side of the issue in the original film. Or a fiction might intentionally leave a question open, as in, and this is a spoiler alert, the case of whether Tony Soprano is killed in the final frame of The Sopranos, this American Mafia show from 10 years ago. Without giving much away, basically, there's a gunshot, and then it fades to black, and we're never supposed to know the outcome of this, basically. We're not supposed to know if the main character was killed or not in the final frame of the show. And in some cases, as Darby et al. Suggests, it's just essential to the original fiction that a particular question remain open, right? According to one view, it's just going to ruin the work if something is disambiguated in a particular way by an author. It will essentially change the very nature or the very artistic essence of the work to disambiguate it. So in each case, whether an extra-fictional communication is a part of a fiction will depend on the nature of the ambiguity or the openness in the fiction. And so we have an extra explanatory burden here in drawing a line between different kinds of ambiguity or openness or indeterminacy in fictions, and seeing which ones can actually be filled in or made determinate by an author and which ones not. Another challenge is explaining whether the extra-fictional communication or the information communicated in it was always true according to the original fiction, or is made true by the author's extra-fictional communication. So, here, when J.K. Rowling says that Dumbledore is gay, are we to suppose that it was just always true that Dumbledore was gay, or that it was suddenly made true at the first instance of the utterance of extra-fictional communication? That's another question the insiderist should probably have an answer to. One worry here is that the view risks blurring the distinction between authorial creation and mere communication. So, we might want, according to certain views of the metaphysics of art, to hold that the act of creation is kind of somehow special, but then over, right? We all know this. If we've written a paper and sent it off, you really want it to be over. You don't want to have to clarify it later. There's something kind of clean about saying that is the work, that is the original work, and what is true, it's just what is true according to the original work. And so what the insiderist is going to have to do is figure out this line between artistic creation and communication if we basically leave it open that the work can continue being created in this way rather than just communicated about. Finally, we reach my preferred view, which is that extra-fictional communications are to be considered cases of what I call borderline fiction. And now we're at the top of your handout on page 3. According to that view, an extra-fictional communication is neither determinately a part of an original fiction, nor determinately not a part of the original fiction. It's a borderline case of the particular fiction to which it relates. So information established in cases of borderline fictions can still be true according to the fiction without it being true of the original fiction. And even when the language of an original fiction is perfectly determinate, and we have all these perfectly determinate interpretations, what is true according to the fiction is not going to be perfectly determinate, because it's indeterminate whether or not an extra-fictional communication counts as a part of the fiction. I take extra-fictional communications to be examples of what Darby et al. Call deep indeterminacy. That is indeterminacy that arises from the structure of a theory, or even indeterminacy in the world. So as a metaphysician, I think that there can be vagueness and indeterminacy in the world, not just indeterminacy in our thought and language. That is going to be one commitment of this view. So if you don't like indeterminacy in the world, you might already be off the boat. That's fine. I will talk you into it. Okay, so here are what I take to be some benefits of this view. First, I think the view does justice to the idea that certain authorial communications are to be taken seriously as additions to their fictional works, while respecting the boundaries of the original fictions. So, on the one hand, when an author communicates something like Dumbledore was gay or Deckard was a replicant, it seems kind of strange to ignore it, right? If we're trying to take the art seriously and we're trying to be the best interpreters and experiencers of the art possible, we want to elevate the author's communications above all of the other people working on it. Like if someone on Twitter is speculating about whether Dumbledore is gay, or whether in hundreds of years when PhD students are writing their dissertations on queering Harry Potter, whether they think Dumbledore is gay, I don't think we want to say that that is going to rise to the level of the author themselves communicating about it. So we want to elevate these communications a bit in terms of the metaphysics of the art. On the other hand, I do think we want to respect the boundaries of the original fictions or the original art piece. We tend to have these strong intuitions about, what the boundaries of the work is, especially in traditional media, like published novels. Now, it might be different, when we're talking about other forms of art, which I'll get to a bit at the end, but, things like someone tweets out a novel, 200 characters at a time over the course of 5 years or something like that. That's going to be a bit less traditional, and we might not have those clean boundaries. But I think in many of the cases I'm thinking about, we just have the movie or the book, and it has these clean boundaries. So again, what I think this indeterminacy view does is it helps us elevate the author's extra-fictional communication while respecting the boundaries of the original work. I think the view also permits the original fiction to remain quiet on a particular issue, while permitting the information contained in the extra-fictional communication to be true according to the fiction. So, we can say something like, well, the original Blade Runner was ambiguous about whether Deckard was a replicant, but now, according to the kind of fiction, it is true that Dumbledore is a replicant because it's true according to that indeterminate part that we're adding on. Another benefit is that the view also includes the possibility of higher order indeterminacy, that is, indeterminacy about whether or not an extra-fictional communication counts as a borderline fiction. So for those of you not familiar with this literature, when we're talking about things that are indeterminate, if we're looking at which particles count as part of a cloud and which ones don't, or if we're looking at how many hairs someone has to have on their head in order to be not bald, one problem is it doesn't seem like we have a strict boundary between these things, so that's the problem of indeterminacy. But there's an extra problem of higher order indeterminacy or second order indeterminacy, where we don't even know when there is going to be a problem with indeterminacy. And I think it helps in this case that we can have higher order indeterminacy about whether an extra-fictional communication will count as a borderline fiction, because often these things are, said on Twitter or said at a private audience or something like that. Such indeterminacy might also come into play when an author grants canonical truth-creating power to another entity. So here, sometimes a showrunner will declare that new comics not written by them are part of the fictional canon. This happened with the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV show created by Joss Whedon. It ended, and then he said, look, the comics that are going to be created a couple years from now should be considered a part of the fictional canon. That is, like a part of the canonical world of the fiction. So he didn't even write it. He didn't even really create it or illustrate it. And yet he basically gave authorial and creative power to the group of people creating the comic books to continue the plot. So I think higher order indeterminacy will help us with these cases. I also think there are some cases where the media are going to be a bit unclear about what the canon is. That is, like the medium of the canon. So consider that Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale, this book about 40 years ago now, but then she has also been involved in the making of the contemporary TV show, including in the writing of the contemporary TV show. So here we have the original book, and we also have the television show, and it seems like what she's doing there is like adding to the fiction in a particular way, even though it's not in the original form, but we don't want to consider it necessarily a part of the original book, and yet we might consider it something like a part of the broad Handmaid's Tale universe as created and intended by Margaret Atwood herself. Here, too, we can use higher order indeterminacy and just be like, look, it's going to be unclear in some of these cases whether there even is indeterminacy. And finally, I think the view does justice to unclear intuitions about these key cases, including those of competent holders of the concept. So I think, we can all nod along with this idea that a fiction's going to have like clear boundaries, and yet it's a bit unclear what to think of these extra-fictional communication cases. And so we want a view that does justice to our unclear intuitions and leaves some room in these cases for argument. And I think that calling it borderline fiction does just that. I also think there are some lessons for other aesthetic modalities. So at least in both visual art and culinary art, the artist and the chef might communicate extra features of the art that can also be considered borderline cases of the art. So in the case of visual art, it's sometimes been the case that an artist will communicate later they intended the frame, like the actual frame of a painting, to be part of the art, and it will be an incomplete piece of art without considering the frame to be a part of the art. This is also true in certain cases of performance art. Sometimes they're meant to be like a complete canon. So I've been an admirer of the Space Invaders all over Paris for a while, and there's this, artist who basically puts up via mosaic all of these little Space Invaders all over Paris and actually other places too now. And so he is like a completist about his art. He's been interviewed about his art and made statements basically after the fact of the art being made about how we should think of the art and conceive of it. So here I think there's some lessons we can draw from the borderline fiction cases. I also think in certain cases of culinary art, we can do something similar. So if you're thinking of a really fancy, well-designed 12-course meal, it might turn out that later the chef tells you, I really intended that 4th course, to be a break from the others, or I intended the 7th one to clear your palate, or I intended the 9th course to really call on the flavors of the 2nd course, or something like that. That might also be considered an extra authorial communication in the culinary realm. So there's some similarities with extra-fictional communications according to written fiction. That is, there's new information precisifying a matter that was previously open to interpretation. And again, I think only certain authorial communications are going to rise to the level of extra-fictional communications when we're talking about those forms of art. There's some dissimilarities with extra-fictional communications. One is that the type of openness to interpretation might be different. So when we're looking at a case of written fiction, like the Harry Potter books, that type of openness to interpretation is going to be a bit different than a 12-course meal or trying to figure out what the artist installing the Space Invaders actually means. And the information in the extra-fictional communication is not communicated in the same aesthetic modality. So when we're talking about written fiction, often an author will communicate through writing, even if that's on Twitter or something like that. Whereas we're talking about like extra authorial or extra work communication in the visual artistic realm or in the culinary realm, obviously that communication is going to be in different media, and that might be metaphysically significant according to your metaphysics of art. So just a quick wrap up so we have time for Q&A. I presented this puzzle of extra-fictional communications. That is when authors of original works put forward an extra piece of information after their work has been created and disseminated. I posed a question about how we should see the relationship between those communications and the original artwork. I put forth 3 views: outsiderism, insiderism, and the view that these are cases of borderline fiction, and argued that the latter account for our intuitions and other sorts of explanatory burdens the best. Thank you.